shortly. But the challenge. So this approach contradicts how traditional theory is structured. Now, I'm not saying that everything is wrong. I'm going to tear down we're just going to say, but what we're saying is the way that we're thinking about things most likely is not the most efficient way if we were to build the system from scratch. And we'll see it as it's codified in the theory, meaning the way we label our chords, the way we label our scales inherently force us away from this modal structure to this renumbering structure, which actually takes longer for us to visualize and open up the fretboard. All right, so music theory evolved historically to prioritize notation and compositional convenience, not necessarily instrument-friendly logic. So in other words, one of the major things, and we'll talk more about this as we go into future presentations and dig into like why were things put together, is gonna be that they wanted to try to write down, of course, what they're doing. With music, that is very difficult to do, clearly. It's a lot more easily done in language once we have an alphabet. We had to come up with an alphabet, basically, for music, and once that was codified, put in a textbook, it became static, of course, right? But now, these days, it's just like with language. Once we had a language, the language changes all the time. But once you put it in a textbook, it's much more difficult to change. So once we had the printing press, the changing of language over time didn't happen so much because it's been codified. There's now a master copy of the way it should be, right, or whatever at that point in time. So that means it's more that's great because it's easier to conform to everybody doing the same thing. But it also means that if there are improvements, then it's harder to make the improvements because now it's already put down in paper. Now, remember, one of the things we have now that allows us to possibly do things differently is the computer and the easy ability to translate things, especially things that are complete logic-based, such as music, for example. So, therefore, this journal requires making the case step by step for why the node-based system is objectively more practical for playing. So hopefully I've given you the general idea on a guitar as to why I think this system will open up the fretboard. If you want to stop there and just say, hey, look, I'm going to use that for the fretboard, and I'm going to start to visualize it from a nodal center point, memorize the nodes, and then I'm just going to conform that to the traditional music theory, thinking in scales and thinking the way the normal intervals are structured. You can do that. That is fine. However, you will run into problems because you're going to start to say, hey, look, the way they're writing the thing down forces me out of the nodal centered structure of thinking because the way the scales are formatted and way the chords are formatted are based on the major and minor scales as though they are the master scales and all the other modes are kind of lesser. And because the numbering system of the scales forces us to think as though we're switching keys all the time, even though we're in the same diatonic key. So what I'm going to do is follow the logic through and say, well, what if I built a full system that was as efficient as I can make it? I'm not I'm a person here, so I might not be making the most efficient thing, but as I see it, what would be the most efficient system? And I'm going to follow that through and then make a case for it. Like, why is the current system the way it is? I don't want to tear down the fence without saying why did they construct the fence? Is it still serving that functional purpose? And then tweak it or adjust things to kind of fix it. That's going to be the general idea. Then the question is, well, if I was to make it more efficient, is it that added efficiency good enough, great enough for me to abandon the way or do something a little bit differently? Because then, of course, I'm going to have to learn to communicate. So I have to bridge the gap. And that's going to be I argue that it would be at least the modal structure, but you can take every step along the way as I follow the logic through and question that question. Is it worthwhile for me to do this point that it's different because it's gonna cause this bridging problem? So exploring why the current system exists, including its historical origins. So as we do this, we'll dig into a little bit of history on this, and I think that's an interesting thing just in and of itself, but we're really doing it from a functional standpoint. Why was it constructed this way? Is it just a convention or does it have a purpose? And that, given that knowledge, that's the only time you should tear something down or change it, right? I don't want to tear down the fence if I'm just saying, I don't like the fence. I don't figure out why the thing was put up in the first place. So I'm going to try to figure out why they did it this way, even though it doesn't look exactly like the most efficient thing, and then think, is it worthwhile for me to think about it a little bit differently? So offering a clear system of translation between traditional notation and the new node-based visualization. So I'm going to think about a different language, like a little bit slightly different way that we can possibly map things out from a nodal-centered system. And every time we do that, we have to then bridge the gap and say, how can I translate that or move between the two systems so I can communicate, which again becomes a lot easier these days as well, because I'm betting, I know to some extent, that you can basically just say, hey, ChatGTP or whatever AI that you're using, this is the system that I'm using, and I would like you to take this piece of music or whatever I'm looking at and translate it to this system. And it's all logic based. The translation will be very easy typically, or you can do it in reverse, right? You could say, this is the logic that I'm putting in place in my language, ChatGTP, here's the logic. I want you to translate it into the traditional system. It should be able to do that quite easy. So in my perspective these days, the argument that this is traditionally the way it's done, therefore, and even though it's less efficient, we're going to keep doing it that way because that's the standardized way, becomes less and less of an argument given the fact that technology is to the point where translation, even of complex languages, is so easy that it's ridiculous, right? So to me, at this point in time, we should be saying, what's the best system and how do we convert to that best system? How do we bridge the gap? How do we translate? How do we get everything into a system where we can get more people learning music faster, right? That would be better.